Our topic tonight is prison abolition. It is today more relevant than ever, in a way where we can see both some risks that the system will worsen and some new opportunities for decarceration and advancing the abolitionist agenda. To give you a few examples, on the one hand, prisons, we've seen how they have handled the COVID crisis. It was totally counterproductive. There's been a lot of lockdowns into small, confined, shared spaces, rather than increasing distancing or encouraging the release of non-violent prisoners, which was actually something that was ordered through some general attorney's memos. But there are also some opportunities, because prisons are increasingly seen as the incubators for COVID-19 and other viruses that they are. For instance, there's been ACLU study that modeled that 100,000 people will die because of US prisons, not in US prisons, because of the transmission in and out. But at the same time, the reaction of the Bureau of Prison has been to tighten its grasp and sort of clench its claws on prisoners even more. On the other hand, among the opportunities, there's been an uprising in the US against white supremacy, which is an essential pillar upon which rests the American prison industrial complex. And so there is an opportunity. But on the other hand, the protests and the looming crisis of our economic system, because of the COVID crisis, might reinforce the prison industrial complex. This is because the prison industrial complex is the one-size-fits-all remedy to all American social ailments, such as mental health, poverty, and of course, racial tensions. Those increasing means that maybe the prison industrial complex will only grow stronger. Its tentacles grab deep and hard in the lives of the most marginalized, continuously constricting the borders of what is considered legal and appropriate, while limiting access to loved ones and support structures. This is why one of the aspirations of our collective, Beyond Return, is to create systems of justice that center on harm prevention and the promotion of care, rehabilitation, and education, systems that do not seek to respond to violence with violence. This is why we demand a world beyond prisons. Jason Linden, in their essay in Queering Anarchism, says that abolition is not only the goal of eliminating all forms of state control, corporate profit of exploited labor, police surveillance, and the destruction of prison walls. It's not just that. It's also the strategy for getting us there. I'm so glad we're here today, all together, to build the path towards abolition. Cynthia, you're this incredible, amazing, radical lawyer. You co-founded Critical Resistance, Justice Now, the Eviction Defense Center. Currently, you are going to appear in a documentary that was just released, and it's called In the Belly of the Beast. It's a documentary that tracks down a story about, a horrific story about enforced and illegal sterilization of Black female inmates in California's correctional facilities. What else should we know about you that I haven't said to introduce you? Please,
Maybe
please.
also that I'm a mom, that I try to run my life in a nonviolent praxis, that yeah, and that I try to learn from my kids every day because they haven't been raised as much as I was to believe in the prison industrial complex, right? So I think many solutions are really to this problem are actually very easy to find and right there. We've just been so conditioned to not see them. And so I learn from my kids every day.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, we believe in the future generation. It's probably less for us, but I hope we can pass on the right thing. And I think one of the goals also for maybe, you know, this salon is to create crumbs and little containers that like create visions for what the next generation can aim for sure.
Yeah. And I guess along those lines, I'd like to say that this moment in history is so amazingly interesting to me because we have enough of a swell of elders who have enough wisdom and have tried and tested some solutions and have started to model things that we can learn from those folks. And I'm one of those old elders. And then we have lots of young people who are willing to take more risks and who have more imagination and who have more creativity than any of us could have ever even foreseen. And it's really this beautiful moment pairing those two things together, right? And the challenge for elders like me is to know when to get the hell out of the way and let younger folks move with their energy and passion and their incredible creativity, and when to offer help. And so it's an honor to be here today to impart some lessons learned. Not that I have to know everything at all, and I'm a life learner, but it's great to be able to have this kind of conversation. So thank you.
That's awesome, and that actually totally brings me into my first question, which is about, I'm going to paste it in the chat so that everyone knows, but it is asking you to which voices are you currently listening about prison abolition? Like, who should we like really pay attention to? Who is doing the right work? And what is the, what are the learnings like from these voices? What are the main like points we should take home?
Right. When I first started doing prison industrial complex abolitionist work, really concentratedly, which is probably around 1995, 1994, there was a real challenge in learning lessons learned from folks who had done this work in the 1960s and 1970s, because so many of those people had literally died, totally burnt out, and couldn't even bear to talk about it anymore, or were in prison. In the United States, activists of that era were targeted by the COINTELPRO efforts in the US. And really, if you imagine youth activists in their teens and 20s having the full force of the FBI thrown at them and aimed at imprisoning them and their extended families, it was really, it was hard to find people to share lessons learned. And so at that time, you know, it was kind of like anyone thinking about this, wanting to rebirth this movement, kind of literally like anybody I would sit down and talk to. Now we have, you know, almost a generation later, right? A generation later, we have a wealth of people who are trained up on both the theory and embraced within the activist community. And so there's a lot of people we can look at. I prefer to look at the grassroots. I'm really interested in seeing what's happening in cities, in municipalities, in towns. I'm more interested in the micro level because I believe this change is going to grow from smaller models out. I'm also really interested in looking at communities that have never been able to seek out help from policing. So people who are in the street economy, sex workers in particular, have been working to find safety and a sense of justice for themselves for many years without ever being able to rely on policing. And I think there's amazing lessons to be learned there about nonviolent responses to violence. And I'm also really interested at looking at what state models have come about. I mean, there's been a lot of attention over the last 30 years, the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation hearings. What was interesting to me about those on a larger level was how we could think about a broader language of human rights to link our struggles across different countries and across the globe, and embrace fundamental affirmative rights that all humans should be able to hold, as well as what a system for acknowledging harms, even if we can't find redress for them, acknowledging harms that were done and create patterns of safety and accountability and acknowledgement that help people who have been harmed feel whole. And then finally, trying to find transformative justice to change it. But anyway, but for me right now, I'm looking at activists doing work for I'm trying to think, the movement for Black Lives. I'm looking at Black Lives Matter Network, but I'm looking specifically at pockets of where it's popping up in little towns and little communities, which before now, one would have thought were too conservative to ever be able to see that kind of change.
And do you have like specific names, actually, like organizations?
Yeah. Well, like even
yeah.
so, I live in a teeny little town outside of a teeny suburb in the San Francisco Bay Area called San Leandro, California. And we are kind of the Ferguson of the San Francisco Bay Area. We're a small, I mean, relatively compared to San Francisco or Oakland, we're relatively small. We have a population of about 70,000. In the 1970s, our town was featured on the cover of Time magazine as the most racist community in the United States. Our discrimination was so strong that there was maybe one Black family that lived in the entire town, and the Ku Klux Klan had an active membership in the town. If anyone Black moved in, they were harassed and forced out. People were terrorized and really had to leave town at sundown. It was a sundown community, meaning that Black people knew they had to get out of town. Now it's the most diverse community by the latest census data in the United States. We're the most integrated community in the US, but our leadership are mostly the children, the white children who were raised in this town when it was a white supremacist holdout. And in the last just 6-7 weeks, I started getting Facebook messages from PTA moms, like for folks who don't know, like the parent teacher associations in the local elementary schools tend to be some very conservative but determined stay-at-home moms. I started getting messages from PTA moms being like, tell me what defund the police means. What does this mean? I started getting messages from teenagers of color who are starting to organize, saying, hey, train us up on how we can challenge the police in our town. And in the midst of all this, our police killed a Black man at our local Walmart store who was suicidal and asking to be killed, and they shot him and killed him in the middle of the store without trying to do anything to diffuse the situation. He was the second Black man who was suicidal who was killed by our police in this year alone. And suddenly there was this swell of people across ages, across races, across class, across gender identity, who are all saying, hey, let's have conversations. So I said, hey, I'll put together a little Zoom group. Everyone, let's come talk about defunding the police, what it means, what it would look like. So 7 weeks later, we've succeeded in having police removed from our schools. We've succeeded in reducing the police budget by $1.5 million. We've succeeded in getting the city to agree to let us have a community committee that will oversee the budget in the town, especially as we face COVID and massive budget shortfalls. The idea is that the community should be able to decide how that money is best set to create safety and sustainability for ourselves at this time of crisis, right? It shouldn't be the police hogging all the money, as has been the case. We're starting to get pushback. The police demanded a seat and one seats on our budget committee, and that's the ultimate example of overreach, like what police officers have to do or what their knowledge is and skill is to construct a city budget. I have no idea, right? But it's the same thing as police don't know how to do homeless outreach. Police don't know how to do mental health services. Police don't know how to be counselors in schools, and they're put in all these situations and hyper militarized, and that has to end. So anyway, that's just my tiny little community. But things like that are cropping up. And if you had told me 2 months ago that there would be a coalition like this in my town, I would be like, get out of here. There's no way. And next weekend, we're hosting a summit, an online summit, bringing everyone from the community who wants to defund the police together. We're expecting over 250 activists to attend online. And that's literally with just 8 weeks of organizing. So it's like there is a swell of transformation happening And I feel like it's a moment of mourning, intense mourning, with the crisis of COVID, the crisis of global warming, which is also bringing about mass economic upheaval and global migration. But there's also this moment of transformation that's so inspiring, just incredibly inspiring.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. In my like risk and opportunities, I didn't bring in like climate change, but I'm sure it plays a massive role. This is an amazing story, and it really adheres to the principle of, you know, like creating like utopia right now, like just building the better system yourself. And so it's awesome, and it feels like super aligned with what we're doing. And I guess it's also a way to, I mean, okay, my second question being, what does your utopia look like? So, you know, a
Right.
world without prisons for you, what does it entail?
So first off, I always say that my utopia is a safe and compassionate world without prisons. As a person who's a survivor of violent crime, I feel very strongly that we have to make sure that people are protected and there's acknowledgement of suffering that happens in the world, and real safety, and that our current legal systems and apparatuses across the globe fail for the most part in doing that. We also typically have legal systems that are very reactive rather than proactive in terms of really addressing root harms. So for me, what that utopia would look like, which honestly, for me, is not really a utopia. It's not that hard to imagine. When I think of a utopia, I think of this like pie in the sky thing that's wacky. And to me, this is not wacky. This is realizable. What it looks like is we have ways of doing sort of an audit to figure out what was missing to help proactively address harm when harms happen. We have, so that we can evaluate not just an individual's responsibility, but a societal responsibility, and what systems might not be in place that we need so that we don't repeat mistakes, right? We don't repeat setting people up in the same circumstances that lead to harm. It also, on the individual level, means creating spaces where, instead of pushing people away and isolating them into the modern penal colonies, which are really prisons, it means holding people who have done harm even closer. It means really looking at what their baseline needs were that might have contributed to the harms. It means creating moments where they can do actions which help atone for the harms that they've created, where the people who have been harmed are involved in the creation of that process of atonement. And most fundamentally, it means that there's actual community acknowledgement when a harm is done, and immediate action to create safety for people who have been harmed. And you know, I never had a situation in my life where I called the police and I didn't regret it. And a big piece of that has been that in situations where I really needed help, I didn't feel like I got safety from that response. And I think that's so incredibly key in what my utopia looks like.
Would you like to share with us a bit more about this, or is it too maybe personal?
Well, no, I mean, even not having to go into my own personal things, but like years ago, so again, my tiny little town of San Leandro, California, my town is known for two things: microbreweries and sausages. Okay, people came from across the world and migrated here and started making their own different kinds of sausages. And there's lots of little teeny micro sausage companies, and there's microbreweries. Okay, so about 10 years ago, maybe 15 now, there was a man who was very well respected in our town. He had run for mayor. He had been on the city council. He was a leader in our town, and he ran one of the sausage companies. And we have a little local newspaper, which everybody reads, renters, homeowners, everybody reads this little teeny paper. It comes out once a week. And he started getting letters published as letters to the editor that were in the news all the time. And they were being published because they were so disturbed, frankly. He was becoming more and more distraught over the fact that the food and drug, or the food inspectors for the federal government were not allowing him to have enough rat poo in his sausage. And he thought this was terribly unfair, that the regulations were governing his sausage company so strictly that they were reducing the amount of rat feces that could be in his sausages. And obviously we're all reading this in horror, and no one wants to buy his sausages anymore, right? But it was bizarre. And every week he was writing more and more letters, and the newspaper was publishing them because it was honestly the hottest gossip in town. Everyone was reading this. Like, here's this respectable guy losing his mind over wanting to have rat feces in his sausages. And he was becoming angrier at the federal government with every letter, right? And it felt like we were watching this person decompensate in front of us, right? But he was becoming more and more outlandish with his anger and his accusations against the federal government. Well, a bit of time goes by, more and more letters get produced, and he ends up ambushing the federal food inspectors who come to his factory, and he kills them. So he ambushes them and kills them, chases one of them down the street with a rifle in the middle of the day, in the middle of our town, and executes the last one. He kills all three of them. Interestingly, several people from our town called the police when seeing him chasing the man down the street. The federal inspector happened to be a black man. The white man is chasing him with a gun, and people were calling the police saying there was a black man with a gun chasing a white man, which is the exact opposite of what was actually happening. So he ended up killing all three of the people, and he ended up being on trial for and facing the death penalty. My feeling about the whole thing was, no matter what happened to him, there was no evaluation of what systems needed to be in our town to prevent something like this happening again. If someone started losing their mental faculties, started becoming very paranoid, out of control, it still would be treated like entertainment. It would still be published in our paper. No one would have any way to do an intervention, and the same kind of situation would happen again. Right? And we also have never really had a conversation in our town about the level of racism that would make eyewitnesses see the entire situation flipped in reverse of what was actually happening, right? And that's how, what I mean by, like, in a utopic situation, right? We would have some ability to say, okay, this man did a horrible act and we have to deal with this horrible act, and we have to have a conversation about what that kind of atonement will look like. We have to have a conversation about what mental health services he needs right now. We have to look at this. We also need to look at what broader systems need to be in place, because we were all witness to this. Literally the entire town watched the buildup to this series of executions of 3 people. And nothing was done for us to be accountable for witnessing that and not doing anything, and not having anything we even could do. Like, it wasn't really actionable under our legal system. And that's what I mean, you know? So if I were a federal food inspector, I'd be scared of every single person in the factory after something like that happened, because there's no guarantee something like that wouldn't happen again. And it's outlandish, right? But anyway, so that's kind of an example.
Yeah, that's an insane story. I mean, thank you for sharing. It's quite intense.
Yeah.
But I think it really drives the point home, actually, and brings also the super interesting point, which is the accountability of the community, which is super important in transformative justice. Well, okay, so earlier on you talked about how your small town precisely has done this amazing like work on defending the police and like almost creating this mini utopia, or like, you know,
little steps
yeah,
towards it. Yeah.
towards it, if you don't want to use the word utopia. So just to dig a little bit more, are there any other models that already exist, like in other places? Where should we look?
Sure. So first, I want to encourage people to just look on a small level around what you've already seen in your lives. We know that 80% of violence is never reported from self-reporting studies. So that means 80% of violence that has probably impacted everybody here in some way at some point has never been reported. That means that there's strategies all around us all the time, of how people have attempted to create a sense of justice or fairness for themselves without relying on policing, right? And wealthy communities have a privilege of privacy in the face of serious harms that lower income communities don't have, especially in the US, because we don't have a right to health care here. If you're assaulted by a spouse, if you're a child and you're harmed, or if a child has mental health issues and harms a parent, right? If you're a person of wealth here in the United States, you can seek out mental health assistance, you can seek out medical treatment if you've been harmed, and maintain privacy. If you don't have that level of income, you have really no choice but to go through a health system where it will eventually come out what happened and police get called in, right? So I want to, like, there's a lot of models happening all around us, especially, frankly, among higher income people, that we could potentially learn from. And the other thing I want to point out is actually really looking at how children resolve disputes. So when I was, so my older daughter now is 19. When she was in the US in first grade, which is about 6 years old, when she was 6 years old, I was at work and I got a telephone call from the principal of her school in the middle of the day. And that's not normal, right? So I'm immediately like, oh my God, what's happened to my child? And the principal's like, there was an incident. Your child was head-butted in the chest on the playground. And I was like, is she okay? Like, am I having to get to an emergency room? Like, what is happening, right? And the principal was like, no, she's really okay. And I was like, well, why are you calling me then at work in the middle of the day, right? Like, what? And I'm like, my adrenaline's flying because I'm like, what's happened? And so the background story to this is that my child, we sought out a preschool for our child before she went even into the public school system. When she was young, when we were doing daycare, we sought out a preschool where she would be around a diversity of children, including children with different cognitive disabilities and behavioral disabilities, because we wanted her to be in a really diverse community. So she actually knew a few children who have autism and understood how to interact with children with autism. So she didn't find kids with autism to be scary. So in her first grade class, and with all the other 6-year-olds, there was a boy who was maybe like 8 years old, a couple years older, but he had an autism diagnosis and was in that classroom because he was just starting to integrate in with the other kids. My daughter apparently was one of the only kids who didn't avoid him because she wasn't scared of him, because it wasn't foreign, right? So the principal calls me and she says, this boy, the boy with the autism diagnosis, had been moved out of her classroom a couple of weeks earlier because he was ready to move up to kids more his own age. And he apparently must have missed my daughter, even though he's not very verbal. And was the first time he had seen my daughter cross a recess field, a play field at the school, was today. And when he saw her, he broke away from his aide and ran headfirst as fast as he could to my daughter, probably to say hello in his own way, right? But headbutted my daughter and threw my daughter into the air and knocked the wind out of her, right? So I was like, okay, well, is my daughter hurt? Does she need to go to the hospital? And the principal says no, but I'm worried she's not angry enough. And I said, what do you mean she's not angry enough? What did she do? Like, I'm like completely puzzled. I'm like, well, what did she do? And the principal's like, well, she asked me what I'm going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I was like, well, that's a really good question. What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? So the principal says, well, we didn't realize what a close affinity he had to her. We're going to have the aide watch him more carefully, especially when she's around. We now know, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, what did she say? And the principal said, well, she seemed to be comforted by that. And I was like, well, okay, I am too. I'm like, well, then what did she do? And the principal said, well, she just didn't seem to be very angry. And I was like, well, I guess I'm confused. She went to an adult. She asked to be sure that she would feel safe. And you seem like you have a real plan for her to be safe. So why is she supposed to be angry? And the principal literally said to me, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know what kind of parent I was calling. And it was clearly a way to police me, to police my child into being more punitive, right? So then I said to the principal, I said, well, now I am really angry. Okay. Like, now you're going to see mommy bear come out, because if my child were actually really angry and hit that child, kicked that child, lashed out, cussed, did whatever she did, then you would be calling me expelling my child, right? Because you're not actually willing to deal with anger in a way that isn't punitive. And the principal is like, well, I'm sorry, I just didn't realize that your family is the way your family is. Right? But here's the deal. My daughter understood that some people are different, right? And people have different needs. And the main thing, the most important thing, was to figure out how could her needs be reconciled with this child's medical issues, right? And there was a legitimate plan put in place. No harm ever happened again. She remained, cautious with that child. It's not like she was running up and trying to beg to be harmed, right? She remained cautious with him, and also still liked him as one of her classmates, right? And so I feel like these solutions are all around us. Part of what the system does to maintain itself is to dismiss these easy ways that we deal with issues and disputes where we can find healing, is to dismiss that as illegitimate and as not really solutions, right? But we have these things happening around us all the time. And so that's one of the reasons I say, like, I look to people who are younger than me, people who have not been as fucked up by our system, right? And see where innovation takes them, right? Because that's what we have to do if we're trying to unlearn the suppression we've been taught with, is to look at people who haven't been schooled that way completely.
Sounds like we should interview your daughter next. No, but actually it would be super interesting to talk to some kids. Like, yeah, it's really inspiring to hear this story. Just out of curiosity, do you know like any like specific system where it has been like implemented, like more like really well working transformative justice practices or community practices?
Right. Well, an easy one that gets brought up a lot is the South African Truth and Reconciliation hearings. I like using that one, even though it's dated to a certain extent, because it also was not perfect, right? So there's lessons to learn from it about what did not go well. So for folks who don't know, after the fall of apartheid, Mandela's government in South Africa wanted to find a new way to promote healing, right? Because it's like they still needed to be a country. And the fear was, if everyone who committed war crimes against Black people was rounded up and imprisoned, you might just replicate a system of oppression that they were trying to fight. Additionally, if you look globally throughout the world in responses to genocide and other harms, there's a way that especially after the Holocaust in Germany, you had lots of Nazis fleeing Germany, moving to other parts of the world and country and living in hiding and not really ever even having a sense of justice, but fleeing the fact that they would be executed, right, if they were brought to justice. So there was a sense that they wanted to do things a little bit differently and think about how you could promote a sense of healing in the whole country, the whole psyche. The South African country was ridiculed by the human rights community led by the United States at that time for not imprisoning people and instead doing this truth and reconciliation process. But so what they did is they had there's multiple phases of it. One of the phases involved sending government tribunals across the entire country to hold sort of speak outs where people could come forward and testify to the human rights abuses that they experienced, and do so in a manner where they would be acknowledged, where they would be taken seriously, whether or not the government was in a situation to punish the person or address that harm or not, right? There still was this sense that it was important for people to be able to be heard and acknowledged, right? So all across the country in lots of tiny little places, these truth and reconciliation sort of speak outs emerged, which was incredibly powerful. Then they separately had a process where people could come forward if they had done harm. They would not be given prison sentences if they cooperated and admitted to the harms that they did, and were willing to work in sort of an alternative dispute resolution process where they would work with the people who survived the harm, whether it was a community or an individual, and come up with a process that would feel like it would represent atonement and healing. It started to work fairly well. The bigger problem was that they never were able to get, I think only about 20% of people who came forward with being harmed ever were able to be in one of those reconciliation tribunals. So 80% of those harms didn't get that process, right, of the human rights abuses people came forward to. But for the ones that they did, it seemed to work so powerfully on a broader community level, like if there were government officials who harmed a whole community, for example, that then people were encouraged to come forward with instances of interpersonal violence. There were two, at one point, there were a case that's been studied highly from it because it involved an American. There was a young white American woman who had come to South Africa to help challenge apartheid, who was the victim of a carjacking and rape and killed by two Black South African men. Those two men came forward and asked to go through the truth and reconciliation process, and they did that with the parents of that American girl, young woman. And eventually just the family and they came to a process by which a foundation would be created in the young woman's name, and those two men would serve that foundation for their entire careers and do the work that had been her vision of building a better South Africa. And that has actually, interestingly, brought that community, or brought those two young men very close to her family, and they have gone through, and it's been documented, a deeply profound healing process through it. So that's sort of like a state level. There's an organization in the United States which has branches across the country called Impact to Justice, which does restorative justice work. It doesn't do the bigger societal level sort of audit of lost systems, but it does a healing accountability process, and they do that only for very serious violent crimes. And so they're really looking at how you can create opportunities for atonement and reconciliation when there is serious violence that happens. And their cases have been remarkably powerful that they've documented, dealing with everything from domestic violence to rape to assault and battery. And it's really fascinating to see how that works. They started off primarily working with juveniles, but they've moved up to working with adults. And again, they have found that that process works best with very serious harms, not with small harms, but very serious ones, because all parties tend to take it very seriously. And then it has the weight behind it, which encourages everyone to actually cooperate with the atonement process.
That's awesome. Again, like, thank you for these like super inspiring examples, and I look forward to myself like you know, digging into that. Actually, I'll share with everyone. There will be a transcript of this, so I'll try to find links and like include them, and so we'll have
great.
a neatly packed transcript of the interview. Okay, so next question is, what are we up against, right? What is in the way of like reaching your ideal vision? And we can think of like global context or local context, norms or systems or legal structures. Where do we find like tensions, and where,
I mean, I think, you know, internationally we're dealing with rising fascism, and that's probably the biggest force we have, which to me actually makes a lot of sense that would be rising now for many reasons. I mean, if you think about the pressures put on capitalism and critiquing capitalism that will be brought forward through global warming, it's sort of natural that capitalism would rise up and encourage a level of nationalism and eugenics to fortify it. So, you know, I think the combination of nationalism, white supremacy, and capitalism is spectacular and very powerful. And certainly in the US, we're feeling this right now in a spectacular way. I just want to emphasize that this didn't come about with Donald Trump's presidency. I mean, much of my work over the last 20 years has been around documenting forced, coerced sterilizations in California's women's prisons, and California is usually seen as sort of a bastion of liberalism in the US and the world. And yet we were absolutely embarking on a eugenic, white supremacist plan to sterilize darker skinned women of color, as well as transgender people in our prisons, with the notion that doing so would both save the state money by reducing the number of people who, through some sort of social determinativism, would require benefits and public assistance, but also really targeting, darker skinned people and transgender people. Really makes it clear that they were trying to eradicate a class of humans, a specific racial groups and demographic groups. So that, for a long time, and actually brought up COVID with the numbers of people who are going to be dying, for a long time when I was a sort of baby lawyer and a baby activist, I would puzzle with, and that was during the beginning, well, not really beginning, the heyday of the HIV epidemic in prisons, where there were people dying every day of HIV in prison. I remember puzzling over the idea of why are we just letting people's medical issues rise to such a level where, emergent care costs so much and it's so unnecessary, and we let people die, and it's both fiscally unsound as well as humanitarily a crisis. Why are we doing this? Like, why? And I had an amazing conversation with an activist in prison at one time named Cherise Shoemate, who's an amazing activist for women's health. And she and another woman, Beverly Henry, were sort of across tables because they weren't supposed to be talking with each other while they were talking to me, were just shaking their heads laughing at me. And they were finally like, don't you understand? It's the best thing for capitalism. It's the cheapest thing you can do to just let everybody die quickly. Like, we're garbage. And Cherise was like, we're garbage. Do you understand that? They're throwing us away. That's what we're fighting. And, she was totally right. And the same thing is happening now with COVID, that we are treating entire communities and classes of people as completely expendable, whether they're workers in the front lines, whether they're people who need public education for their children, whether they're elderly people and we're asking them to sacrifice themselves for the economy, for their grandchildren. It's incredibly eugenic. And that's totally part of fascism. And that's where we're in the midst of that storm right now. And honestly, we just need to survive this shit and get through it, because I think we're going to win. But that's part of the battle, is seeing the other end of it.
Wow, yeah, it's not a small obstacle, right? It's pretty serious.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna win.
We are gonna win.
How are we gonna win? Like, what actions do we need to take to win?
Right.
What should we do?
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is, for people who are white like me, I think it's important to stop seeing yourself as an ally and see yourself as someone who has an affirmative responsibility to change white supremacy and nationalism. It's our problem. It's our cross to bear. We're the ones who are benefiting from it, and we need to do whatever we can to dismantle it. That means having hard conversations with family, with friends, with people on the internet, whoever. It means not just having the privilege to defriend someone and walk away from them if they're too annoying. It means, for the long haul, being in there and having those conversations. If you're someone who's physically able to get out and protest, it means get out and protest. If you're not, it means figuring out how you can support the people who are on the front lines, whether it's helping take care of their kids, whether it's sending them care packages, whether it's helping buy them groceries, whether it's getting them out of jail, whatever it means affirmatively doing that work. And I think it means also picking up the language of the movement. So, for example, not shying away from the words defund the police because it rubs some people the wrong way, but saying, no, this is literally what we're talking about. Police budgets have been hyperinflated. We're going to reduce it and allocate money out to where it really needs to be. And that's also the words of the people of color on the front ends of this movement. If that's the language they want, that's the language we need to use. So I think I think just doing an evaluation of your life and the praxis and how you're living, and pushing yourself every day to do something more on some level that's supportive of that global struggle for freedom.
That's yeah. And that would be like for the individual level. Is there anything on like the collective that we should be
Absolutely.
looking for?
Well, I mean, that's collective too, right? Because it's like supporting the collective and supporting the organizing effort. I think that, well, okay, in the US, part of the result of the Trump administration is a destruction and dismantling of many governmental institutions. I don't know that everyone who's down for this movement wants anarchy. There's other people, when they look at COVID, who want a public health response. So on a large scaled manner, whether or not that has, though, anything to do with capitalism is sort of different and questionable. I think people have to start figuring out those solutions and being part of that change too. So whether it means running for office, whether it means really attacking the leaders that are in charge, it means resisting, collectively resisting authoritarianism and calling it out as such. And I really do think, like, the community group that I'm part of, this is not professional activists. These are not people who being, you know, some sort of social justice warrior as part of their job. They're not working for nonprofit organizations or NGOs. They're just people who are coming together and figuring out a structure where they're collectively, they have more power to start aiding to the dismantling that's already happening of our government, but then replacing it with what they'd rather see. Anyway, I think there's a real need to have I mean, look, I think we're in store for a global depression on a scale that we just can't even fathom right now. And so we're also going to have to really rethink how we're going to reproportion resources for people really to survive. And that has to become a focus.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. Well, thank you, Cynthia. That was like incredibly rich, this interview already. And now I'm happy to open for a more like Q&A session where we can, you know, all the people who have joined here, at least of those I know, have like a rich variety of experiences, whether it is like as activists or academics or with the prison system themselves. So I hope we can like continue and strategize. Is there anyone who has questions about what Cynthia just discussed? And are there areas that we have forgotten and we should explore? Oh. You can post in the chat. I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Yes, probably, right? Zarina, you have a question.
Hello, I've got a question. Yeah, I wanted to first of all let people know to either put your hand up or unmute yourself. Cynthia, that was so amazing. Thank you so much. I was frantically taking notes for all of that. I've got so many questions, but I'll ask one, which is, I think, you know, so you touched on something which is, you sort of mentioned that these grassroots organizations are really where a lot of the prefiguration is happening and experimentation. I think that's totally right. And you also touched on this idea that these processes these alternative to these less violent processes, such as restorative and transformative justice, tend to work best in situations where the harm is really serious. And this resonates for me a lot. I do a lot of restorative and transformative justice work. And one of the places, one of the barriers, I think, is that people are very afraid to make mistakes. They're very afraid to try and tackle an alternative process and make a mistake, especially under the sort of carceral feminism that we live under now, which is very aggressive and seen, you know, often to be anti-feminist, to try and work with perpetrators of harm. And so I think what I often find is that the most sort of privileged communities are the least open to this, the most carceral and punitive, the least open to trying alternatives. And so I wonder, whereas when I encounter other communities who have been doing this, they have forgiveness and sort of generosity comes very naturally. And I wonder if you have a sense of like, how do we bring these grassroots sort of programs and endeavors together so that we're actually learning from each other, and so that we're more visible to the world, rather than having these marginalized communities and sex worker communities building for themselves. Meanwhile, sort of tech communities are extremely sensitive to any kind of microaggressions, and cancel culture is rife. Like, how do we bring these worlds together so that we're actually building something viable? So it's a very long question.
Okay, I think that the feminist community needs to really check their classism in a huge way. I mean, like, I do think that, you know, challenging white supremacy is central. I also think classism is deep, and some schools of feminism, particularly dominance feminism, is rooted in a level of elitism that, and also gender rigidity, that is deeply destructive to being able to build a movement. And I understand at a nascent early stage of movement building, sometimes one has to be exclusionary in order to define what the movement is. That moment has passed. That moment has passed 40 years ago, and those feminists of that school are still back in that moment. And what they're really doing is dismissing and harming anyone who disagrees with them, in a way that's really fragmenting and destroying the community and the potential for joint activism. And doing that on a way that is, again, incredibly gender rigid, incredibly classist, and just, anyway, my feeling is that folks who continue to behave that way should not be allowed to call themselves feminists. They're constantly pushing back at folks who have different schools of feminism and saying, no, we are like the feminists. It's like, no, actually, you're bigots. What you are is bigots, and they should be starting to be called bigots, and they're also very violent. And so anyway, I don't parse words well with folks in that feminist community. I think it's incredibly harmful. And the lack of understanding of intersectional oppression is deep and extremely troubling. But anyway, I think the feminist community would get a resurgence of strength and be able to find its roots and commonalities in intersection with many other movements if we could cleanse ourselves of that micro subsect that really, frankly, is full of bigots. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents on that.
Great. So we need a strong critique of sort of, you know, yeah, bad feminism. That's great.
I mean, anyway, I want to say, like, when I founded Justice Now in 2000, that organization was founded to really make sure that people in women's prisons who have an incredible experience of experiencing interpersonal violence that's never been acknowledged by anyone in the state, and also not by most feminists, and also an experience of doing disproportionately long prison sentences for survival crimes, right? So the goal in founding that organization in collaboration with people in prison, it was the first organization in the US that governing board was comprised of people in prison, currently in prison. So our treasurer was in prison, our president was in prison, like the officers were in prison. Part of the reason to found that was to start doing work with people who are directly impacted to create solutions, and also to reclaim the label of feminism around a different standard of womanhood, frankly. And, you know, almost our entire board were people with histories of working in the sex industry. Our board also included transgender people. Our board, and it was shocking that there could be communities of small enclaves of feminists, not the broader movement, who would lash out at the empowerment of this group of people who were doing incredible work from inside prison, behind prison walls, risking literally their lives on a daily basis to do that activism, and that they could be critiqued as somehow anti-feminist by a group of so-called feminists, right? So anyway, we have to start transferring leadership of the feminist movement to people who are directly impacted by harms, and academics need to understand that they need to step away if they're not part of that movement. Anyway.
Great. That's wonderful. I think there are some questions there, Lou.
Yes. Yeah, please, Toshi. It would be nice to hear about you. I think you can. Oh, Toshi and Lisa. It's a double.
Yes.
Head.
Hi.
Oh, awesome.
Just calling in from San Mateo. Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you for presenting today and sharing so much. I'm working on a project right now about looking at prison reentry. I'm just curious, Cynthia, if you have any sort of insights or thoughts around what are the areas of innovation that we think we should be looking at?
I love the New Way of Life Foundation that's run by Kim Carter. I don't know if you've come across a New Way of Life. Okay, so Kim Carter started off in Orange County. She's a formerly imprisoned person herself. She started a number of reentry homes there, and now she's moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. I think her homes are in Dublin, Pleasanton. She's kind of broken the mold of reentry. She places homes in residential, nice, really middle class to upper middle class neighborhoods. Her feeling is everyone deserves to be in those kinds of beautiful neighborhoods with those kinds of resources. She uses private homes and complies with the zoning requirements and faces lots of upset and like not in our backyard opposition, but has figured out a model for doing that. And the homes are run in a collective capacity by the people who are in them. Her home so far had been for women and children, with the women coming out of prison and reunifying with their kids. She's also started one green, larger house community, which is like an apartment complex in Orange County. And one of the things she wanted to do with it being green was to find a way for the people to have lives that were more self-sustaining and also healthy. So that facility was built with garden plots that women from the program can grow vegetables, but then they also have a farm stand where then they can sell the vegetables to people using Section 8 vouchers. So people who work the garden can then use their Section 8 vouchers to buy their own produce and get some of that Section 8 money in their own pockets. Do you understand? Which is brilliant, and a way of redistributing the wealth back into the community. And the ways that she thinks about how to create sustainability through reentry is spectacular. She also integrates politicization within it. So there's advocacy trainings and ways where people can become empowered around actualizing their own rights and become part of the solution while in the program. So there's formal legislation and advocacy trainings and leadership development. Her whole staff has been built up from people who have graduated from the program, and it's amazing. So I would say check out A New Way of Life. It's brilliant, maybe the most brilliant reentry structure that I've ever come across.
Thank you so much. What was Kim's last name?
Carter. Kim Carter.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We also have a few people on this call who are in our housing, which is similar. It's housing in San Francisco in middle class neighborhoods for formerly incarcerated people who've also served life sentences, integrated housing. And I think Bert and Kevin and who else is on here? Rick are all in that area. So if anyone wants to hear about houses in San Francisco, you can reach out to them after.
Yeah, maybe we should tell a little bit more about it. It could be cool, or I don't know if people are interested.
Yeah, it's a very similar model. We have 2 houses now in San Francisco, both in the Lower Haight, and they are intentional community houses for people coming home from life sentences in California prisons. They are integrated houses, and they're half formerly incarcerated people and half not. And they are sort of embedded in networks of other intentional communities. So they are hubs of sort of connectivity. And I think what feels really unique about them is that they are self-determined houses. So everybody, they're not managed by some external force, but people are, self-managed. They have their own bank account, house bank account. Actually, maybe I don't want to speak about this. Kevin or Bert, or who else is on this call? One of you guys want to share a little bit, just like a quick, I don't know if you can unmute.
What do you want me to share?
Just maybe what it's been like for you, or anything you want to share.
I mean, yeah, it's autonomous. It's beautiful. There's nobody governing us. We live our own lives, and we give back to the community. It's really pro-social. I don't know what I've done without it personally. It's been a major change in my life after 3.5 decades of imprisonment. So, and I love Cynthia's message. I mean, I actually know some of those groups. I'm part of Initiate Justice, and this has been such a dream for a lot of us that come out. This what the Embassy Network has put together for us, and it just gives people hope, and everything you guys are doing gives us hope. It really does. And if we can be a small part of it, just throw us in there. You know what I mean? I love this house. I love this community. I'm not going nowhere, even to Maine, just so you know. But yeah, I mean, any questions you have, please just reach out. I'm open, willing to discuss anything you need to know. You know what I mean? So, okay.
That's awesome. Who runs the home that you're in?
Well, it's autonomous. I mean, we basically run it ourselves. I mean, Serena's kind of like our grand dame. she's our compass, our guiding light, or whatever you want to call it. But we're basically left to our own designs to accomplish what we need to accomplish, and you know, be part of this community and give back. And so it's not really nobody runs it. It's a community that runs it, and it's a vast community of really beautiful, smart, intelligent people. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering, was there funding that was secured to get the home, or was it an individual's home and they just opened their doors to people, which is what happened with Kim Carter's first house. It was literally her house. And she opened her house, and then she figured out a way to fundraise for another house, and she opened a house. So
people helped us. I mean, the people that used to live here actually moved out so that we could establish this process. I don't know how to say it. It's not a program or anything like that. So it's
yeah, I guess I can chime in a bit.
Yeah, help out.
I'll let Bert speak too. I think.
All right, I guess I'll chime in.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may. So a lot of the work that we're doing here is modeled after what we formerly incarcerated have witnessed throughout the system of what we wanted to see in the world. And something that I learned about the embassy is that it's a place of experimentation and learning, and you know, bringing the resources together to create this world that we want to see. And so it's been fairly easy to model, because I'm just going off of the things that I didn't agree with throughout my incarceration. I served 20 years on a second degree murder, first 15 a life sentence. Throughout that time, there was a lot of things that I seen that dealing with sex offenders, dealing with all of these things that to address a lot of these issues. So the idea is to create the world that we want to see. So there's no institution, there's no way, there's no like programming in place, because I myself have been through both programs that was funded by the city, and I couldn't help but feel like a number, a product within a system, and that's exactly what I was. And it came to a point, like even throughout my incarceration, that I was nothing but a product in that system as well. Like when I first started my time, I thought it was punitive. I thought it was like, you know, I did a horrendous thing and I'm atoning for it. But then it came to a point where I realized that it wasn't even about the crime anymore. It was about filling that blue shirt, to filling in that bed, that it was allocated tax dollars to do this. And then something much more sinister started to like bubble up inside me, like, holy shit, I am a slave to a system that they don't even give a shit about the crimes that are being committed. They just care about getting paid, and it's all centered around getting money. And it's like it's a total scam. And I was like, a total legal scam that, you know, and I'm like, now we're getting into like matrix shit, you know? And so, anyways, trying to get to the space where, you know, what can we do to support one another, to help each other, to heal from the institutionalization? I mean, we're trying to bring people in, and we get questions all the time like, what can I do? What do you want to do? You know? And like, you know, the dishes don't get done unless we do them. And it boils down to the simple things. That simple idea to address these issues, we're not going to do nothing. The dishes don't get done unless we do the dishes, right? Simple as that. And take that model, and to address all these issues, we have to create the agency. You know, we have to do the work. And that's what we're trying to do here.
And it's a lot easier to get those dishes done if you have friends helping you.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think I like to sort of talk about these places of like empowerment. It's about like when you've been completely controlled your whole life, how do you really like get ready for autonomy again? And that's not something you can really do alone. The other thing I should add is that these spaces, you know, are supposed to try and heal the harm done by the carceral system, but also lots of people in these communities are also involved in our restorative and transformative justice sort of processes. And so the idea is to sort of try and create an engine that like works on all sides of the harm cycle to really start flipping the coin. But you know, we need more of these things. Yeah, it's tough.
That's really inspiring. Like hearing about this community is really amazing. And it's such a gift to be able to learn about it. Thank you.
Yay, come and stay.
Yes.
We have guests.
We got spots for you. We'd love to have you.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, I loved it. I think it was a perfect also story to finish and wrap this up. And I love to talk about like really concrete examples of these utopias or near utopias. Cynthia, thank you again so much. It was, you know, on multiple levels, like very rich, very inspiring. I think you gave like so many examples. You know, you made it very real, I think, this vision for us. And yeah, it was amazing. Thank you.
Cool. So can I end on one funny little story note?
Yes.
Which is, so when my older daughter, because she's 4 years older than, right before I had my second child, we went on a little trip. I had to go for work to San Diego anyway. And so I was like, okay, this is our last hurrah. And so she was like about 3.5, 4. And we decided to go to Legoland because she really, really liked Legos. And in Legoland, there's this exhibit that's made out of Duplos, which I don't know if folks know, but that's like when little kids have these big Legos, they're like really big Legos, right? And so they have this like whole toddler town, a US town built out of big fat Legos, right? And the kids run through all the little parts of the town and get their pictures taken. And then there's, you know, like water sprayers going off and different things, like, so they run around and play in that. So the Duplo town had in it, it had a fire department, which was like the holdout of sort of, I don't know, like a welfare state component of the US structure, like one of the last holdouts of the benevolence welfare state. It had sort of an individual house, which is this idea of like the nuclear family living alone and the goal of like home ownership being part of the American dream, right? And then it had a jail. And it has like the sheriff department jail, right? So all these kids are running into the jail, the Duplo jail, and holding on to the rungs and getting their pictures taken in a cell. And I'm like, yeah, no, hell no, right? So I was like, baby, in our family, we don't play jail. And if mommy does her job right, someday we're going to come here with a bulldozer and we're going to pull that shit out. And there's going to be Duplos everywhere that we can play with, and we get to build something new instead of that jail, right? And so I think that's what's both inspiring to me about doing this work, and then also represents the challenge, right? Because it's like, to win, we got to get a bulldozer into Legoland. And one day we will, and then we can envision a really cool new thing to build, right? And so anyway, so I just wanted to end with that. And thank you for creating a space to be able to envision something else, because that's so important. Thank you.